Hello everyone, and welcome to the new episode about editing with Darktable. In this episode, we will continue our discussion that we have started in the last episode about dealing with the contrast when we are using Sigmoid module as tone mapper. And in this episode, we will talk about alternative ways to increase that contrast when we are using Sigmoid as tone mapper. So, let's get started. In the last episode, we have seen how can tone equalizer be used for contrast adjustments, and we have mostly used two instances, one for dealing with the dynamic range of the photo for dynamic range compression, and the second instance as a simple tone curve for the contrast adjustment. But we can also use another tools. For example, color balance RGB gives us also a few nice options for the contrast adjustments, and let's see what kind of adjustments can be done with the color balance RGB. In color balance RGB, we have three different areas where we can adjust our contrasts. The first area is the master tab. We have contrast slider and also perceptual brilliance grading sliders for that. In the second tab, we have those luminance sliders here, offset, lift, gain, and power. And in the third tab, we have some masks that can be useful to readjust some things that we have done in master on 4-ways tab. So let's start with the master tab. In the master tab, the first option that we have is the contrast option. And if I increase the contrast, I can increase or decrease the contrast there. And as you can see, we have a nice contrast curve here. And we can also adjust that contrast in the mask tab. We have contrast gray fulcrum. That means I can choose particular area to be the focus of the contrast. For example, if I want to more contrast in the highlights, I can use that color picker and choose those area in the highlights. As you can see now, we have more contrast here than in other areas. If I want the midtones, I can use that color picker for the midtones, or if I want to use it in the shadows, now I have much more contrast here. This kind of contrast, what we have here, is not quite useful for the whole image. It's much better if you have some masked area that you want to adjust the contrast, and you can use that contrast with help together with contrast gray fulcrum. Much better options are those options that we have in perceptual brilliance grading. The first slider, global brilliance, acts more or less like exposure module. So you can decrease or increase and decrease the brightness of the whole photo. So let me compare that with exposure module. You see it acts quite similarly. And the next slider, shadow slider, acts more on the shadows, but let's see how it works. If I move that slider down to the shadows, let's say about there, and as you can see, we have some kind of slope here, and it influences not only the shadows, but also almost the 2/3 of the photo. So we are influencing this area here. And by decreasing the value of the shadows, we are compressing the darkest shadows, but we're increasing the contrast in this area here, as you can see. Now, let's see what happens if we go to the other direction. And now we are increasing the contrast in the darkest areas, but decreasing the contrasts in the midtones. And of course, this area is more or less untouched. And that means we have some crossover with shadows to the midtones. That is quite important to know. What does the midtone slider? If I move it up and down, as you can see, it influences more or less this area here, or let's say here. But we have some strange bulge. So that means if we use it quite extensively, we could have some compression in some areas. So this slider is not very useful for huge changes, but it only influences the midtones. And then we have the last slider, highlights. So let's see what highlights does. Now if I increase the value, you see we are influencing this area. So that means the highlights slider are influencing upper 2/3 of the photo, and also in opposite direction. Shadows are untouched, as you can see. Okay, that means for those two sliders that are quite important, shadows and highlights, they have some crossover in the midtones. And we can use them for increasing the contrast, but we can adjust that crossover in the masks. So let's talk about that a little bit. So let me decrease the shadows first a little bit, and then go to the mask, and we have here 3 sliders. Shadows fall off. Let's see what happens if I move the shadows fell off to the right and left and right and left. So you see, we are practically increasing the steepness of that curve that we have added in the master tab, or decreasing that. The same works also for the highlights. If I move the highlights higher to the left, to the right, excuse me, and then move the highlights fall off to the right, I'm also increasing or decreasing the steepness of that curve. You can also see that a little bit in these graphics here. So what that thing does. Okay. Now let's say we want to shift that contrast a little bit to the highlights or to the shadows. Let's start again with the shadows, increasing that. And we have now that mid-gray fulcrum. As you remember, every of those sliders works in 2/3 of the dynamic range. So they have crossover in the midtones, and we can shift that towards highlights or towards shadows, excuse me, or towards the highlights. So once again, if I move the shadows down, now I can shift that influence of that contrast in this direction or in this direction. So if we want more contrast in the highlights, so we need to shift that mid-gray fulcrum towards the highlights. You see now we have practically more contrast here and less contrast in this area. And opposite, if I move the mask middle gray fulcrum to the left, now I have much more contrast here and much less contrast there. That also works for the highlights. So let me increase the highlights a little bit. And now I can shift that contrast towards highlights or towards the shadow, as you can see. Or let's see, we can add We can increase the contrast in the midtones by decreasing the shadows, contrast in the shadows. You'll see we are increasing the contrast a little bit here, and increasing the contrast in the highlights. And now we have here the most contrast. And now we can shift that midtone or that mid-gray or that crossover to the highlights. And now you can see we have here now the most contrast. So these are quite useful functions, and I highly suggest to try that. We will now experiment a little bit with the raw files. Don't forget to use them because they're really useful. Okay, but before we do that, let's talk about Four-Ways tab. Those sliders here in Four-Ways tab, you can find, or that adjustment, that kind of adjustments, you can find in the most of the advanced video editors. For example, we have here primaries wheels in DaVinci Resolve, and this is practically the same adjustments that we have in Four-Ways tab: lift, gamma, gain, and offset. Gamma is practically power function by Darktable. And as you can see, you have for every of those area also luminance slider and hue slider. We are not talking about hue slider now, just the luminance slider. And let's see what happens with luminance in the global offset. If I move it to the left, I'm practically decreasing the black point of the photo. And if I go in opposite direction to the right, no, we don't have any poor black. So we can regulate the black point of the photo with global offset. Then we have shadows lift that works quite similar to the shadows in the master tab in the perceptual brilliance grading area. So if I move the shadows down, I have that kind of contrast here, or if I move it up, I will increase. It also goes have a little bit of crossover in the midtones, but not that much as shadows in brilliance. And highlights gain, also quite similar to the highlights in the master tab here in perceptual brilliance grading, but the power function is a little bit different. A power function works in mostly in the mid-gray, but the whole dynamic range or the range is influenced, but mostly in the midtones. It's called gamma in some other applications. And this power function, if you use it, you should adjust the white point for that function. For example, if you have white point here, and then you can use power function. Okay, but I'm using it sometimes, not that much. Okay, let's see. Oh, by the way, I forget to say, also those sliders can be influenced with masks. So masks works for perceptual brilliance grading and also for Four-Ways tab. Okay, let us see some examples in the raw files. Let's start with this one from the last episode, and we will also use Sigmoid neutral gray preset, because I want Sigmoid only to protect my dynamic range and doesn't do any additional contrasts, so that the whole contrast can be added with color balance RGB. And in this case, as you know from the last episode, we have enough contrasts here in the shadows. What we need to increase, contrast in the mid-gray, and that is here the 3 and maybe in the highlights. So we can use color balance RGB and just increase the contrast in the highlights. So we will increase a little bit the values in highlights. As you can see, maybe it's that too much, and we can readjust it with the masks, just to shift the mid-gray towards highest highlights, and we have now nice contrast. We don't need to do anything else, maybe just a touch of midtones, and we are good. Only thing what we need to do is to add some saturation, and we're practically done. As you can see, we have enough contrast in the shadow, so we don't need to deal with that. And we have only added a little bit contrast in the highlights and midtones and adjusted the mask, and we are good. Let me try one other example. Let's say this one. And in this one, we need first to bring our main subject direct in that mid-gray. So before I do that, I'll of course also need neutral gray as a preset, so that we have only the gamut protection with Sigmoid. And now I can go to the exposure, add some exposure until I'm satisfied with brightness of my model, let's say there. And as you can see also in the waveform, we have quite a lot of room in the shadows, but not that much in the highlights. So we can decrease more the shadows and add just a touch in the highlights, and also play with that middle gray fulcrum, go up and down. And I think we're quite nice here. I can also decrease a little bit the black point with global offset until I'm touching the border, and we're good. Saturation with just one instance of the color balance RGB. Okay, now of course I could also, if I need that area here, some details there, I can also use tonic equalizer to darken a little bit the highlights, but it's not necessary. As you can see, it's completely okay to have it like that. We don't have any details there needed there, so we can concentrate completely on our main subject. Okay, I think these two examples are enough for this version, and now we will go back to our gradient here and see what can be done if we enable the default preset of the Sigmoid. So when Sigmoid has his own contrast, what can be done then? We are now back in our gradient graphics, and I have enabled scene refer default for Sigmoid, and as you can see, we have already some kind of contrast curve in default version. But the first thing what we can do, we can readjust the contrast to our liking also in Sigmoid. For example, if we want more contrast in the highlights and less in the shadows, we can shift that skew slider to the right, and you see we are losing contrast in the shadows and increasing that contrast in the highlights, as you can see just with that movement. And we can also reduce the contrast itself and move the slider and so on. So we have a little bit playroom just with those two sliders here. But let's leave it in the default for a moment, and we can readjust also that contrast with the contrast color balance RGB. For example, if I want more in the highlights, I can also move the highlights up, and now I have that much that high compression here, but I can regulate the fulcrum of that contrast towards highlights, for example, something like that. And now I have increased a little bit the contrast in the highlights just with the contrast slider under that area. And if I want to improve it even more, I can go to Sigmoid and add a bit more the contrast in the highlights with the skew, and remove a little bit contrast with overall contrast and so on. So you can readjust your contrast in Sigmoid and use color balance to help you to readjust it even better if needed. So before we get too theoretical, let's try that also in our raw files. And now we are back in our first raw file. And now I will enable the default version of the Sigmoid, and as you can see, we are clipping here, and that's because Sigmoid uses wide gamut color space for the primaries, and we can change that to the sRGB, and we are good to go. And we can analyze our contrasts, and this default version, the contrast in default version of the Sigmoid is too high for the shadows, so we need to adjust it a little bit. We can go a little bit down with the contrast in Sigmoid and maybe shift also the skew in this direction, so that we are shifting practically the contrast from the shadows more to the highlights. And we can now use color balance RGB just as before. We're going to increase a little bit contrast in the highlights and adjust the masks. Maybe just a touch on midtones, shadows, midtones, saturation, and we're good. So this is without, and this is with color balance RGB. So just with Sigmoid and color balance RGB, we have increased or adjusted our contrast on saturation. Let's try next example, this one, for example. The same thing. I need to use scenery for default, maybe also sRGB just to be sure. And in this case, I don't even need that much. What I need to do is just to increase the exposure, because Sigmoid gives already quite nice contrast here. I don't think we need to do anything else. Maybe just a touch shadows and highlights and saturation, and we're good. In this next example, also the same. Let me enable scenery for default. We are clipping here because of the white gamut, but we can change it really quick to sRGB, and we can leave it as it is, because we also need here to shift our mid-grade so that we are able to see clearly our main subject, and that is the face of our model. And I don't care about highlights in the moment. And what I need to do, I need a little bit more contrast in the shadow, so I can use color balance RGB and increase that, maybe in the midtones, just touch, and we're good to go. Now, if you want those the more details in the highlights, of course you can use tone equalizer, but I don't want them, because in this case it's those details in the highlights are quite destructive. So next example, let's use this one now, and of course we will enable Sigmoid scenery fill default with sRGB. And now, similar to the last example, we need to increase the exposure so that we see the face of our model quite clearly. And now we're good. And the advantage of that setting here is that Sigmoid already gives us a nice contrast, so we don't need to adjust that much. So maybe also just a touch in the shadows, maybe just a bit in the midtones, and we need to increase the saturation. And if you want to get a bit more details in this area here in the highlights, we just can use tone equalizer and reduce that brightness in that area, and we are good. I don't think we need any more details here, because that's the most important part. I would say I would even, we can also use it in color balance RGB. We can increase global variance just a touch. And of course, in this case, we can also use brightness, channel brightness, like that. I don't want to play that much. Let's say about there, and we're good. And also in this example here, what have we used in the last episode? We need to go with exposure quite high, because before you do that, I need to adjust the Sigmoid to the scene referred and working profile. And now we can go to exposure module and increase the brightness. And this is the area which is quite important, so it is quite nice. We have already great contrast here. We don't need to do anything else. I don't think we need to touch color balance contrast options here. We need only a bit saturation. I can go even higher with exposure. Let's say there. And maybe just to decrease the black point. Well, we are clipping here. Okay. And now if I need more details in the highlights, I can use tone equalizer for that. I can use it maybe just to decrease that brightness here in the highlights. Now, in this case, I can also have another approach. I can go, let me adjust the sigmoid again, sRGB. I can also use exposure and go about there, and then use tone equalizer as in the last axle linear invert, readjust it so that I can have that compression. That's maybe too much, so let me go a bit lower. And now I can use color balance RGB to increase the contrast in the shadows and also in the highlights a little bit, and we are good. I don't need too much details here. No, if I want more, I can add more tone equalizer module and just decrease those highlights here and so on. So we don't want to spend that much time on that. And that is, as you can see, quite quick and easy solution. Let me try this one again, this one as the last one for this kind of example. So we have already quite nice contrasts in this case, but we have also high dynamic range, so we can go with exposure quite high. And maybe in this case, I also need to relieve the contrast in the shadows in the sigmoid, maybe move this one here to have that contrast more in the midtones or in the highlights. And now we can use, or we can go even a little bit higher. And now we can use color balance RGB. Oh, come on. Just to find adjustment. Masks. Let's say there. And if I need a bit more details in this area with highlights, I can also use just one instance of tone equalizer and go down a little bit with the highlights. And we are good. As you can see, we see all details, and you don't need to do any magic here. We see every detail in the shadows. We are not too dark. What I can do, if I want, I can also decrease just a touch the black point, and we're good. You see how quick you can readjust your photo just with those 4 modules. We have used Sigmoid, color balance RGB, eventually, if needed by such high dynamic range photos, tone equalizer and exposure. And we're good. Okay, and now I have been asked what I'm using as Sigmoid as preset, and let's talk about that. The preset that I'm using is one of the presets that you also have, and that is the smooth preset. The only change that I have made is to change that white gamut color space Rec 2020 to sRGB to the output color space, because I have no intention to make any work after Sigmoid. So Sigmoid can immediately protect that output color space, and I only need to watch in the waveform here and to enable the clipping indication, and I have all control that I need. And this kind of preset is made for some difficult light situations to take into account some specificity of our vision. For example, with high intensity red light or by sunsets, the red is shifted a little bit towards yellow, only in that highlights, and also in high intensity blue light, the blue is shifted a little bit towards the cyan to mitigate those few effects like Abney effect or Betzel-Brücke shift and so on. So it's practically some adjustment. We have here some adjustment to our vision in difficult light situations. The second thing that is also quite important is that desaturation of the highlights. You see we have here red attenuation. That means we have more or less saturation in the highlights for the red, green and blue also, and I like that kind of look. It's practically contrary from what many of you want. I'm quite a fan not to have that much saturation in the highlights. I need that gradient from in the saturation also, and I will show you one example why. And one other thing that this preset does is soften the highlights. Also, the contrary to many of you, I'm not fan of high contrast in the highlights. Let me demonstrate you real quick. If I enable color balance RGB and add some saturation in this photo, and we are using now Sigmoid, that kind of preset, and oh, that's too much. Let me go a little bit back, about there. And I would also like to add some brightness. Let's say about there. And when we compare that, for example, to scene referred standard, let me disable that indicator for a moment. You see that softness in the highlights here, or maybe I can also show you. Now, if we go with skew up, you say we have a lot of contrast, and in this case, it's not that nice. And this preset gives me immediately, because of the skew is a little bit lower, the nice soft look in the highlights. And also these color changes are quite interesting. So let me show you the difference. If I go with preservation of hue to the 100%, so we have completely the hue as it is. But I like that small transitions from especially in the reds, from the yellow in the highlights, or more yellow in the highlights, towards more red in the other areas, in the darker areas, because it gives the photo, the skin tone, for example, some more differentiation, which can be quite interesting. Now, if I want to change that, I won't change anything here. If I think that for example, the face is more yellowish, I can go to the RGB primaries and shift that a little bit in this direction, the red hue towards magenta, and I still have that differentiation from the, let's say, orange to the reds, and I like that. So those three things are important for me, especially in the portraits. I have that soft looking contrasts in the highlights. I have the saturation gradient from the less saturated highlights area to the more saturated darker areas, and I have that color shift especially in the skin tones. But it's not only for the portraits, it also works quite well for me, all for the other examples. So let me show one example where this kind of setup works quite well. We have here one colorful photo, and both copies are internal JPEGs, and we will use this one now to try to improve it with Sigmoid, with this preset that I'm using. And the only thing that I need to do is just to adjust a little bit of saturation and in shadows and midtones, maybe also vibrance, and just add a touch of contrast. I think we could go even higher with saturation. And now, when we compare that, you see the big difference. In this case, we have here almost, it looks almost as the woman has the sunburn, and we here have a nice transition or nice gradient from less saturated highlights into the more saturated darker areas. And you can recognize that also in the face, the both part in this area and this area have almost same saturation, but we have that differentiation and that looks much more natural to me than this one. That is the first thing. The second thing, we have increased also the contrast through that saturation gradient. So that is the third art of the contrast that we have. One is, first is the differentiation in the brightness. The second is differentiation in the colors. We have used some examples for that photo with a tree or other photos where we darken the sky. And we have now the third art of the contrast, and that is the contrast between high saturated area and low saturated areas. As you can see, that is why this preset gives me a quite nice starting point. So of course you can do that also with color balance RGB and masks, but I like that kind of smooth highlights and less saturation. Let me give you one more example. Here we have a nice portrait, and actually needs crop, but I don't want to bother. We are going directly to the color balance RGB to improve the saturation and a little bit the brightness of the photo. Just a touch about there. And you can see we have immediately quite nice colors. We can compare that now with default setting of the Sigmoid. So let me maybe just change that to sRGB so that we don't have any clipping. Take a snapshot and compare that with smooth contrast. That is the default version of Sigmoid and a smooth contrast here. As you can see, we have a bit more differentiation in the skin tones. So we start more with a little bit yellowish and go into the red. And only thing that I could do here or would do is just go to the primaries and go just a touch in this direction. So change the hue of the red a little bit towards, in this case, not always, towards magenta. And now we have quite nice colors. You see, not only the skin colors, but also the colors of the sky are changing, very pleasant. I could add just a bit more saturation for the, so that you maybe can judge it a little bit more. Yeah, that is the first thing. And the second thing, as you can see, okay, there's not much more difference in terms of the contrast of the highlights, but what I can do, I can now increase the contrast in the highlights to see the difference. As you can see now, we're also using the whole range, but we have too harsh, to my taste, too harsh contrast there. I don't want that. I think that is much pleasant. Now, if I need, for whatever reason, need more saturation in the highlights, if I have lost them here, I can just use the target white and increase that white point to the edge of the dynamic range. Maybe we are too far, about there. And I have enough of saturation there. Maybe once more, before and after. So that is the reason for that preset, and that works also for other scenes, for landscape and whatever. If I need some changes, I can do it immediately here. I don't need to change some other preset, use some other preset. I can change it immediately there, make hue preservation up or whatever, or change the contrasts to the liking, and that's not the issue for me. So if you want to sort of, if you ask what kind of preset you can use every preset that you find good for you. The only important thing that needs to be understood is what all those sliders are doing, and you can readjust that to your liking. So whatever preset you use, you need to understand what is happening and not use some preset because someone else use it. And that is the reason what I will say in this case, that is really my own liking, or my own taste. I don't want to recommend it to everyone. So please understand that that is not the thing that you should do because I'm talking about that now. But you can use it also. You can try it. And my advanced advice will be just change few presets and see what works for you, and try to play with those sliders and find a nice preset if you need it, or you can use one of those that you already have and readjust it if needed. Okay, that's enough for this episode, and in the next episode we will talk about a little bit about those issues in the highlights, those loss of the contrast in the highlights, and eventually, if I have time, I would also like to talk about color lookup table and how can you use it to improve your photos. Okay, thank you for watching, and until the next time.